The security guard at First National Bank of Las Vegas had been watching the same routine for 3 years. Customers coming and going, tellers counting money, and the occasional complaint about ATM fees. Carlos Mendez thought it was the most boring job he'd ever had after 15 years in SWAT. That Tuesday morning at 10:43 a.m., when four men in expensive suits walked through the front door with briefcases that clinked when they moved, Carlos realized his quiet retirement was about to end very violently. I wonder where you're watching this unfold from today. Whether you're in the bright lights of Vegas or a quiet town somewhere else, you've probably walked into a bank and noticed the security guard. Maybe you wondered about their story, their background, what brought them to that position. Most of the time it's just a job, but sometimes, just sometimes, that quiet person by the door carries a history that could save everyone in the building. This is one of those stories. Carlos Mendez arrived at First National Bank every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., 45 minutes before the doors opened to the public. At 52, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who no longer needed to rush anywhere. His security uniform was always pressed, his badge polished, and his graying hair kept in the same military short style he'd worn for the past 30 years. The bank sat on the corner of Fremont and 3rd Street, in the heart of downtown Las Vegas, far enough from the Strip to feel like a different city entirely. It served the locals, construction workers cashing paychecks, small business owners making deposits, retirees managing their modest savings. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would attract the kind of attention that brought trouble. Carlos's routine was simple and predictable. Check the overnight security reports, test the metal detectors, review the camera feeds, and position himself at the security desk with a clear view of both the front entrance and the teller line. He'd nod to the arriving employees, make small talk with regular customers, and spend most of his day observing the peaceful, mundane rhythm of small-town banking. "Morning, Carlos," called Linda Vasquez, the head teller, as she unlocked her station. "How's retirement treating you?" Carlos smiled at the running joke. Linda knew his story: 15 years with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police SWAT team, including some of the highest-profile operations in the city's history. But she also knew he preferred not to talk about it. "Can't complain," he replied, the same response he'd given every morning for 3 years. Quiet is good, and it had been quiet. In 36 months of working bank security, Carlos had dealt with exactly 4 incidents: 2 drunk tourists who got confused about where they were, 1 customer who had a panic attack during a busy lunch rush, and a homeless man who wanted to use the bathroom. Nothing that required anything more than patience and basic human kindness. By 8:15 a.m., the bank was ready for business. Carlos took his position at the security desk, a simple metal table with a clear view of the entire floor. His responsibilities were straightforward: monitor the metal detector, keep an eye on the lobby, and make sure customers felt safe. The most complex decision he usually faced was whether someone's belt buckle was big enough to warrant a second pass through the scanner. The morning customers were predictable. Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher, came in every Tuesday to deposit her pension check. The Martinez family owned a small restaurant and made their weekend deposits on Tuesday mornings. A handful of construction workers from the sites downtown would cash their checks before heading to work. Carlos knew them all by name now. He remembered their children's birthdays, asked about their businesses, and listened to their complaints about everything from the weather to the city council. It was the kind of community interaction he'd never experienced during his SWAT years, when every human contact was either a fellow officer or someone on the worst day of their life. "You're like a bartender," his daughter Maria had told him during one of their weekly dinners, "except instead of serving drinks, you serve security and small talk." She wasn't wrong. There was something therapeutic about the role, about being someone people trusted with their everyday concerns, instead of their worst emergency. After 15 years of kicking down doors and facing armed suspects, Carlos had found genuine peace in checking IDs and asking about grandchildren. The transition from SWAT to bank security hadn't been immediate or easy. Carlos had retired from the police force after what department psychologists called cumulative stress reaction. Not a breakdown, but the natural result of 15 years spent in constant high alert mode. The specific incident that triggered his retirement had been a domestic violence call that went wrong. A man with a history of mental illness had barricaded himself in his apartment with his ex-wife and their 2 young children. What should have been a routine tactical entry had turned into a nightmare. when the suspect had used his own children as human shields. Carlos had been the marksman tasked with taking the shot if negotiations failed. For 6 hours, he'd held his position with a clear sightline to the suspect, knowing that if the situation deteriorated, he would have to make a decision that would haunt him forever. The standoff had ended peacefully when the suspect's mother arrived and convinced him to surrender. But Carlos had realized something important in those 6 hours. He was tired of pointing guns at people. The department offered him desk duty, training positions, administrative roles that would have kept him on the force until full retirement. But Carlos had declined them all. He wanted something completely different, something that would let him help people without the constant possibility of violence. Bank security had seemed perfect, important enough to matter, routine enough to be peaceful, and it used just enough of his observational skills to keep him engaged without keeping him awake at night. Carlos lived alone in a modest apartment 15 minutes from the bank, but he wasn't isolated. His daughter Maria was a nurse at Sunrise Hospital, and they had dinner every Sunday after church. His son David was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, carrying on the family tradition of service in his own way. Maria worried that her father was wasting his talents in bank security, that a man with his experience and skills should be doing something more significant. But Carlos had tried to explain that significance came in different forms. Helping Mrs. Patterson feel safe while depositing her pension check was significant to Mrs. Patterson. Making sure the Martinez family could conduct their banking without worry was significant to their small business. "I spent 15 years protecting people by being ready to hurt other people," he told Maria during one of their conversations. "Now I protect people by being ready to help them. It's a better way to live." He joined the neighborhood watch committee, volunteered at the community center, and even helped coach his neighbor's kid in baseball. For the first time since joining the military at 18, Carlos felt like he was part of a community rather than someone whose job was to stand apart from it. Tuesday, October 15th, 10:40 a.m. The morning had started exactly like every other Tuesday. Mrs. Patterson had deposited her pension check and asked about Carlos's daughter. The Martinez family had made their restaurant deposit and invited him to try their new breakfast special. A handful of regular customers had conducted their routine business. Carlos was reviewing the security camera feeds on his monitor when he noticed something that made him pause. A white sedan had been parked across the street for 20 minutes, which wasn't unusual by itself, but the car had tinted windows, Nevada plates that looked too new, and hadn't moved despite the 30-minute parking limit in that zone. Old habits kicked in. Carlos made a mental note of the license plate, the vehicle's position relative to the bank entrance, and the fact that he could see at least 2 occupants through the windshield despite the tinting. Probably nothing, but worth monitoring. At 10:42 a.m., his attention was drawn back to the bank interior by the sound of the front door opening. 4 men entered together, which was unusual but not unprecedented. What caught Carlos's eye was the way they moved, not like customers but like a team that had rehearsed their entry. Carlos's SWAT training had taught him to read people in the first few seconds of contact, and these 4 men sent up immediate red flags. They were dressed in expensive business suits, but the suits fit wrong, too loose in the shoulders, as if they were designed to conceal something. Their shoes were rubber-soled, practical rather than decorative, the kind worn by people who might need to move quickly. More concerning was their behavior. Instead of approaching the teller line or the customer service desk, they spread out across the lobby in a pattern that gave them coverage of all the exits and clear sight lines to the bank employees. One positioned himself near the front door, another moved toward the rear exit. A third took a position that let him watch the teller stations, and the fourth approached the customer service area. The briefcases they carried were another problem. Carlos had seen enough equipment cases to recognize when something was weighted wrong. These weren't full of paperwork or contracts. They clinked softly when the men moved, the sound of metal against metal that suggested tools or equipment. Carlos kept his expression neutral and his movements casual, but his mind was already shifting into tactical mode. 4 suspects, coordinated movement, concealed carry capability, unknown equipment, positioned to control all exits. This wasn't paranoia, this was pattern recognition based on 15 years of experience. At 10:43 a.m., Carlos's assessment became certainty. The man nearest the front door reached inside his jacket and produced a small electronic device that he pointed at the bank's security cameras. Carlos recognized it immediately, a signal jammer designed to disrupt wireless camera feeds and communication systems. In the same moment, the man near the teller stations opened his briefcase and began removing items that were definitely not business documents. Carlos caught a glimpse of zip ties, duct tape, and what looked like a modified tablet computer. This was it. This was a coordinated bank robbery, planned and executed by professionals who had studied the bank's layout, security systems, and daily routines. They weren't here for a simple grab and run. They were here for a methodical, controlled heist that would leave no witnesses to identify them later. Carlos had maybe 30 seconds before they revealed their weapons and took control of the situation. 17 people were in the bank, 12 customers, 4 tellers, and the branch manager. If he hit the silent alarm now, police response time was 6 to 8 minutes minimum. These men looked like they could control the situation and be gone in 5. Carlos made his decision. Rather than reach for the obvious alarm button, Carlos used a technique he'd learned during hostage rescue training. He reached under his desk and activated a different alarm, a silent signal that went directly to the LVMPD SWAT dispatch, bypassing regular patrol units and going straight to the tactical response team. More importantly, he sent a specific code that indicated armed robbery in progress, officer on scene, coordinate response. It was a signal he'd hoped never to use, but one that would bring the right kind of help with the right kind of training. Then Carlos did something that went against every civilian security protocol but aligned perfectly with his SWAT experience. Instead of hiding or evacuating, he began to position himself for tactical advantage. He stood up slowly, as if simply stretching his legs, and moved to a position that gave him a clear line of sight to 3 of the 4 suspects, while keeping his back to a solid wall. He palmed the pepper spray from his belt. Bank security wasn't allowed to carry firearms, but Carlos had other resources. Most importantly, he began to make eye contact with the bank employees, using hand signals he'd taught them during routine security briefings, but which they'd assumed were just theoretical. Linda Vasquez, the head teller, caught his signal and began to quietly alert her colleagues to prepare for an emergency lockdown. As Carlos watched the 4 men continue their setup, he began to build a tactical profile of what they were dealing with. These weren't desperate amateurs or opportunistic criminals. They moved with military precision, had professional-grade equipment, and showed the kind of coordination that suggested extensive planning and training. The man jamming the cameras was likely their tech specialist, responsible for neutralizing security systems and communications. The one with the control equipment was probably the leader, coordinating timing and managing the operation. The 2 positioning themselves at the exits were muscle, responsible for controlling the scene and managing potential threats. What concerned Carlos most was their professionalism. Amateur bank robbers made mistakes, acted impulsively, and could sometimes be talked down or confused. Professional crews like this one had contingency plans, backup equipment, and the kind of cold calculation that made them much more dangerous. But professionalism could also be a weakness. These men had clearly planned for bank security systems, police response times, and civilian panic. They probably hadn't planned for a retired SWAT officer who knew their playbook and could think tactically under pressure. 10:44 a.m., the transformation happened in seconds. One moment, 4 businessmen were standing casually in the bank lobby. The next moment, they had produced weapons and taken complete control of the situation. "Nobody move. This is a robbery." The voice belonged to the leader, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, who spoke with the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His weapon was a compact submachine gun that he'd somehow concealed under his suit jacket, professional equipment that confirmed Carlos's assessment that these weren't ordinary criminals. The other 3 men revealed their own weapons, 2 more submachine guns and a shotgun that one of them pointed directly at the teller stations. The customers in the lobby froze, several of them dropping to the floor instinctively. Everyone on the ground, hands visible, no sudden movements. The leader continued, "We're here for the bank's money, not yours. Cooperate, and nobody gets hurt." Carlos remained standing, his position near the security desk giving him a clear view of the entire situation. The robbers hadn't specifically addressed him yet, probably assuming he was just another customer. That was an advantage he intended to keep as long as possible. From his SWAT experience, Carlos could see exactly how this robbery was designed to unfold. The 4 men had positioned themselves to control all movement within the bank, while maintaining clear sight lines to each other. The electronic equipment they deployed would prevent the security cameras from recording their faces and block most cell phone signals from reaching the outside. The leader moved toward the teller stations while keeping his weapon trained on the prone customers. One gunman remained at the front door, watching the street for approaching police vehicles. Another positioned himself at the rear exit, preventing anyone from fleeing through the employee area. The fourth man, the one with the shotgun, began moving among the customers, securing them with zip ties. Carlos estimated they had maybe 4 minutes before his silent alarm brought SWAT response, but the robbers clearly planned to be gone in less time than that. This was a precision operation designed to extract maximum cash with minimum exposure. The problem was the 17 innocent people caught in the middle. Bank robbery protocols emphasized compliance and cooperation. Let the professionals take the money and leave, because money could be replaced, but lives couldn't. But Carlos could see details that the average person would miss, indicators that suggested these men had no intention of leaving witnesses who could identify them later. Carlos's concern deepened when he noticed the leader consulting a tablet computer that displayed what looked like the bank's floor plan. These men hadn't just planned the robbery. They'd conducted detailed reconnaissance of the building layout, security systems, and operational procedures. They knew exactly where the vault was, how to access it, and how long each phase of the operation should take. More troubling was the systematic way they were securing the hostages. Professional bank robbers typically wanted to get in and out as quickly as possible, taking only the cash readily available in the teller drawers. But these men were preparing for a longer operation, something that would require extended control of the scene. When the man with the shotgun began separating the hostages into groups, bank employees in one area, customers in another, Carlos recognized the pattern from his law enforcement training. This was preparation for a more complex operation, possibly involving the vault or safety deposit boxes that would require cooperation from bank personnel. The leader confirmed Carlos's fears when he approached Linda Vasquez at the teller station. "We need access to the vault," he said calmly. "You're going to help us with that. If you cooperate, this will be over quickly and nobody gets hurt. If you don't cooperate, we'll start with the customers and work our way up to the employees." First National Bank's vault was a sophisticated system that required two-person authorization to open. Linda Vasquez had one access code, and the branch manager, David Kim, had another. Both codes had to be entered within 30 seconds of each other, and the system included biometric scanners that verified fingerprints. But the vault also had emergency protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of forced access. If opened under duress, silent alarms would immediately notify law enforcement and the bank's corporate security. The vault could also be remotely locked down by bank headquarters if they detected unusual activity. Carlos knew these protocols because he'd studied them as part of his security training. He also knew that professional bank robbers would have studied them too, which meant they had a plan to circumvent or overcome the security measure. His suspicion was confirmed when the tech specialist produced a sophisticated electronic device that he began connecting to the vault's control panel. This wasn't a simple smash-and-grab operation. It was a carefully planned heist that could involve millions of dollars from the vault and safety deposit boxes. Carlos's tactical training told him that SWAT response was still at least 2 minutes away, even with the priority alert he'd sent. The robbers seemed to be working on a timeline that would have them out of the bank in less time than that. But something was wrong with their precision operation. The vault access was taking longer than expected. The electronic device wasn't working as quickly as planned, and Carlos could see frustration beginning to build among the crew. Professional operations depended on precise timing, and when that timing got disrupted, even the best planned crimes could fall apart. The leader was consulting his tablet more frequently, checking his watch, and communicating with his team through earpieces that suggested military-level coordination. But Carlos could see the signs of a plan that was starting to unravel. When the tech specialist shook his head and said something Carlos couldn't hear, the leader's body language changed. The calm professionalism was being replaced by urgency, and urgency led to mistakes. 10:47 a.m. Carlos saw the moment when the robbery transformed from a professional heist into something much more dangerous. The vault access wasn't working as planned, the timeline was slipping, and the crew was beginning to show signs of stress. The leader made a decision that sent chills down Carlos's spine. "Change of plans," he announced to his team. "We take what we can from the teller stations and the safety deposit area. Then we clean up." Clean up was criminal code for eliminating witnesses. These men had apparently decided that if they couldn't execute their perfect heist, they would settle for whatever they could grab and ensure their escape by making sure no one could identify them later. Carlos had been in enough tactical situations to recognize the shift in dynamics. What had been a controlled criminal operation was becoming a potential mass casualty situation. Professional criminals were dangerous, but desperate criminals were lethal. Carlos made his second critical decision of the morning. He couldn't wait for SWAT response. 17 people were about to become murder victims unless someone acted immediately. Using techniques he'd perfected during countless high-risk operations, Carlos began to move. Not obviously, not in a way that would immediately draw attention, but with purpose and precision. He activated the bank's emergency lockdown system, which sealed the front entrance and triggered additional silent alarms. The robbers would notice within seconds, but it would also prevent their escape and signal their exact location to responding officers. More importantly, Carlos began to position himself for what SWAT training called a single operator intervention, a situation where one officer had to neutralize multiple threats to protect civilian lives. The man guarding the rear exit was the first to notice that something had changed. The emergency lights had activated, the front door had sealed, and his earpiece was picking up radio chatter that suggested law enforcement was close. He turned toward the bank interior to alert his team, which gave Carlos the opening he'd been waiting for. Carlos moved with 15 years of tactical experience behind him. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance to the gunman, used a compliance hold to control the weapon, and put the man down with a sleeper hold that left him unconscious but alive. The entire engagement took less than 10 seconds and happened in an area of the bank that was partially concealed from the other three robbers. Carlos now had a submachine gun and had reduced the threat by 25%. Carlos's SWAT training had taught him that in multiple opponent situations, the key was to create confusion and force opponents to react to your actions rather than execute their own plans. He had maybe 30 seconds before the other robbers realized their rear guard was down. Using the bank's layout to his advantage, Carlos moved through the employee area toward a position that would give him clear sight lines to the remaining three gunmen while keeping the hostages out of his line of fire. This wasn't a movie scenario where he could take dramatic shots. This was a precision operation where every bullet had to count and collateral damage was unacceptable. His next target was the tech specialist, who was focused on his equipment and positioned away from the main group of hostages. Carlos approached from behind using the same silent movement techniques he'd used during hundreds of SWAT operations. The specialist went down as quietly as the first gunman, leaving Carlos with two more weapons and two remaining threats. The leader noticed the absence of his team members exactly when Carlos expected him to. Professional criminals maintained constant communication and situational awareness, and the sudden radio silence from two of his men would immediately signal that something had gone wrong. Martinez Rodriguez report, the leader spoke into his earpiece, his weapon sweeping across the hostages as he tried to locate the source of the problem. Carlos was already moving to his final position when the leader spotted him. The professional criminal's reaction was exactly what Carlos had anticipated: trained, disciplined, but operating under the stress of a plan that had completely fallen apart. LVMPD SWAT, Carlos announced, his weapon trained on the leader while keeping the shotgun-wielding robber in his peripheral vision. Drop your weapons, it's over. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds, but felt like an eternity to everyone in the bank. The leader was a professional who recognized that his situation had become hopeless. Two men down, law enforcement on scene, escape routes compromised. But he was also someone who had committed to a course of action that included eliminating witnesses. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the fourth robber made the decision for everyone. Stressed, panicked, and seeing his careful plan destroyed, he swung his shotgun toward the group of hostages. Carlos's response was instantaneous and precise. 15 years of SWAT training condensed into a single moment of perfect execution. 2 shots, center mass, neutralizing the immediate threat to innocent lives. The leader, seeing his last team member down and facing a tactical professional who had systematically dismantled his entire operation, made the smart choice. He dropped his weapon and assumed the surrender. The SWAT team that Carlos had called arrived 4 minutes after his initial alert to find the situation completely resolved. 4 armed robbers were in custody, 17 hostages were unharmed, and the bank's security officer was calmly providing a tactical briefing on what had occurred. The responding team leader, Sergeant Patricia Williams, had worked with Carlos during his SWAT years and wasn't entirely surprised by what she found. "Couldn't stay retired, could you, Carlos?" she said as her team secured the scene. "Retirement found me," Carlos replied, checking on the hostages and making sure everyone was receiving medical attention for shock and stress. The FBI investigation that followed revealed the scope of what Carlos had prevented. The four-man crew had been responsible for a string of sophisticated bank robberies across the Southwest, stealing over $3 million in the past 18 months. They had never left witnesses, and law enforcement had been unable to identify them until the Las Vegas incident. The electronic equipment they'd brought to First National was designed to crack the vault's security system and access safety deposit boxes containing cash, jewelry, and other valuables that could have totaled over $10 million. If successful, it would have been one of the largest bank heists in Nevada history. More importantly, the investigation confirmed what Carlos had suspected. The crew's standard operating procedure was to eliminate all witnesses. The 17 people in the bank that morning had been scheduled to die once the robbery was complete. The story of the retired SWAT officer who single-handedly stopped a professional heist crew made national news. Carlos found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight with interview requests from every major network and offers for book deals and movie rights. He declined them all. "I was just doing my job," he told the one reporter he agreed to speak with, a local Las Vegas journalist who had covered his SWAT career. "Bank security means protecting the bank and the people in it. That's what I did." The bank's corporate headquarters had a different perspective. They offered Carlos a promotion to regional security director, a position that would have tripled his salary and given him responsibility for security at dozens of branches across Nevada and California. Carlos politely declined that offer too. 6 weeks after the robbery attempt, Carlos was back at his security desk at First National Bank, checking IDs and making small talk with customers. The bank had installed additional security measures and upgraded their systems, but the daily routine remained largely the same. The difference was in how people treated him. The customers who had been in the bank that day looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe that made him uncomfortable. The bank employees treated him like a celebrity, which was even worse. Miss Patterson, the retired teacher who made her weekly deposits, summed it up best. "Carlos," she said during one of their usual conversations, "I always felt safe when you were here. Now I know why." Carlos's daughter had watched the news coverage with a mixture of pride and exasperation. During their next Sunday dinner, she brought up the subject he'd been dreading. Dad, you saved 17 people's lives. You stopped a robbery that could have been the crime of the century. And you want to go back to checking IDs and asking about people's grandchildren?" Carlos had thought carefully about how to explain his decision. "Maria, for 15 years I carried a gun and pointed it at people because it was my job to protect other people. I was good at it, but it was hard, really hard. When I retired, I wanted to protect people in a different way, by being someone they could trust, someone who made them feel safe just by being there." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What happened at the bank wasn't me going back to being a SWAT officer. It was me being a security guard who happened to have SWAT training. There's a difference." Maria smiled. "And you're happy checking IDs and talking about grandchildren?" "I'm happy knowing that Mrs. Patterson feels safe depositing her pension check. I'm happy that the Martinez family can run their business without worrying about their bank. I'm happy that kids can come in with their parents to open their first savings accounts and see that banks are safe places." What Carlos didn't tell his daughter, what he hadn't told the investigators or the reporters, was the deeper truth about what had happened that morning. For 15 years as a SWAT officer, he'd been trained to respond to violence with violence, to solve problems by being better at controlled aggression than the criminals he faced. But the bank robbery had been different. Yes, he'd used his tactical training and his weapon skill, but more importantly, he'd used his experience in reading people, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his understanding of how to protect innocent lives while minimizing harm to everyone involved, including the criminals. The 4 robbers were all in federal prison now, but they were alive. The 17 hostages had gone home to their families without physical injury. The bank had reopened the next day, and the community's sense of security had been restored rather than shattered. That was the kind of protection Carlos wanted to provide, not just the absence of danger, but the presence of safety. 6 months later, the bank had returned to its normal rhythm. New customers had replaced the memories of that Tuesday morning, and Carlos had settled back into his routine of security checks and friendly conversation. He'd made one small change to his daily preparation. Along with testing the metal detectors and reviewing the camera feeds, Carlos now spent a few minutes each morning reviewing tactical scenarios and response protocols. Not because he expected trouble, but because the 17 people who depended on him for security deserved to know that he was ready for whatever might come through the door. Mrs. Patterson still made her weekly deposits and asked about his daughter. The Martinez family still invited him to try their new menu items. The construction workers still cashed their checks and complained about the traffic. But now, when Carlos looked around the bank lobby each morning, he saw something different. He saw a community space where people felt safe enough to bring their children, to conduct their business, to trust their financial security, to an institution protected by someone who understood what protection really meant. Some people might see a waste of talent, a highly trained tactical officer, spending his time checking IDs and making small talk. Carlos saw the most important job he'd ever had, being the person who stood between ordinary people and the chaos that existed in the world outside. And every morning when he unlocked the front door and turned on the lights, Carlos Mendez knew he was exactly where he belonged. The quiet heroes among us don't always carry badges or wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear security uniforms and check IDs at bank entrances. But when the moment comes when innocent lives hang in the balance, training and character reveal themselves in ways that remind us why experience matters and why the people we see every day might be more extraordinary than we ever imagined. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes come in all forms, even retired ones working security jobs they love.